That's okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for just getting organized here. Thank you for joining us this evening from the Old Mill in the historic landmark village of Waterford, Virginia. This is our very first online artist talk, Quilts, Barns, and History, with quilter Jeannie Nichols and artist Jill Evans-Kavaljian. My name is Lisa Kovach, the Waterford Foundation's Education Associate. Just a little housekeeping as we go along this evening. Please type your comments and questions in the comment section of Facebook Live, Instagram Live, or YouTube Live, and we'll field them as we're able. Jeannie Nichols has been sewing all of her life, but picked up quilting in earnest when she retired after 30 years working in museums. History of textiles was the primary focus of her master's degree, and in work and retirement, she has organized exhibits of historic and contemporary quilts. In between piecing quilt tops, she continues to consult and volunteer with small museums. A member of the Waterford Quilters Guild, she also serves on committees for the Loudoun County Barn Quilt Trail, Western Loudoun Art and Studio Tour, Loudoun County Art Advisory Committee, and Friends of Franklin Park Center Advisory Board. Besides working with these organizations, she enjoys using her experiences and skills to help promote Loudoun County artists, crafts, and arts organizations. Welcome, Jeannie.
Jill is going to talk more about the Loudoun County Barn Quilt Trail and the committee, how we got started, and the various moving parts. But one of those parts is developing a list of quilt block patterns that we wanted to have on our website to make it easy for barn owners to pick a pattern, decide on it for their barn quilt sign, and they could also propose one of their own if they wanted. So I volunteered to help develop the list of quilt blocks. We had several criteria for our patterns and decided early on that we wanted mostly traditional patterns. And of course, the log cabin block is a very well-known traditional pattern. And it's believed, it first appeared in the 1860s and is believed to have been linked to Abraham Lincoln's log cabin campaign themes. The center red square is typical and is supposed to represent the hearth, the focal point of the home. And of course, the name log cabin comes from the narrow strips of fabric arranged around the centered square to resemble the stacked logs of a cabin. Now, the block in the photo on the left is from a pieced log cabin quilt in the Loudoun Museum collection. This block has connections to historic structures and architecture in Loudoun County. Log cabins were among the earliest structures in Loudoun, dating back to the 18th and 19th centuries. And you can see examples across the county, including the Settle Dean cabin, pictured here on the right, and also some log structures here in Waterford. The log cabin pattern on a barn quilt sign could be done as 1 or 4 blocks. There are a lot of variations of this pattern depending on how the blocks are arranged, and lots of ways to arrange the blocks themselves in different patterns. And often those patterns also have their own names. We also wanted our be a little bit different from other quilt trails. So we decided that ideally the patterns we offered would have some connection to Loudoun County, meaning that they were from a quilt that was locally made here, appearing on a historic quilt that was made in Loudoun, or that it could relate to the barn that the quilt sign was on, or the farm, or even the family history of the barn owner. But most of them would have some relationship to agriculture or landscape or architectural features. So we also had one of our partners as Visit Loudon, our tourism organization, and they wanted the trail to illustrate connections to features that would also attract tourists to Loudoun County, besides the Barn Quilt Trail. Our history, rural character, museums, wineries, fairs like the Waterford Fair, and so on. This particular pattern has at least 20 different names, and of course it was the quilter's choice as to what name they used. It's a traditional pattern handed down from older to younger quilters, mother to daughter, passed among friends, and so on. One name is churn dash, in referring to the butter churn and the stick or dash that was used to turn milk into butter. Historically, the churn was a familiar and basic piece of equipment in rural Loudoun homes, and the dairy industry was a very important part of our local agriculture. By the late 19th and the first half of the 20th century, the Loudoun countryside was dotted with barns, dairy cows, and fieldstone spring houses, all part of a thriving dairy industry. Another name, hole in the barn door, came from the square or hole in the center of a barn door that allowed horses and other large animals to put their heads outside the barn. Equine traditions go back to the 18th century in Loudoun, and today it's home to many equine-related businesses. This block in just 2 or 3 bright colors would look good as a single block or in a group of 4. Another criteria, of course, was visual appeal, meaning a colorful, appealing design. Rail fence here, I guess I can point to it on the left, is one pattern that would be more interesting in an arrangement of 4 blocks. Loudoun County is known for its fences that keep livestock, such as cows and horses, from escaping the pasture. And rail fences made of split logs, split lengthwise into rails, are used in rail fences. Loudoun also has zigzag fences made of interlocking rails supported by cross poles. And you can see both of those driving around the countryside. The schoolhouse block is another traditional favorite. For a barn quilt sign, it could be a single block or a group of 4 with sashing, the lines in between, and on the borders in this block. There were once many one-room schoolhouses in Loudoun County that were built and used in the 19th and 20th centuries, and a few remain and have been restored. One of them is the 2nd Street School in Waterford that was built soon after the Civil War ended in 1867. And it was built for the education of African American children of the village of Waterford and continued in use until 1957. The foundation purchased it in 1977 and today offers a living history program to area school children. A last criteria for our quilt trail signs was a simplified pattern that used little detail or textures in the design. And that was in part due to our digital print process that Jill may talk more about. And also the fact that you can't see a lot of detail from the ground or if you can't get real close to the barn quilt sign. So we avoid crazy quilt squares and detailed applique like you see in this Baltimore album quilt on the right, and the more contemporary art quilts and landscape quilts. Using a neutral background and limiting the detail and color also helps simplify the design. Now, wreath blocks with grapes or other fruits, leaves, or flowers were favorite patterns throughout the 19th century as a symbol of hospitality. They were especially popular on mid-19th century album and applique quilts. And an album quilt is where different patterns were used in the same quilt. Grapevines and wreaths were also used in the actual quilting designs that quilted the top, middle, and back together. And wreaths of grapes are especially appropriate for Loudoun's thriving vineyards, again, a feature of the countryside across the county. And this pattern also serves as a reminder to visitors to stop at a winery and taste some of the wine as they travel the Barn Quilt Trail. Quilting in America was done by individuals and also was an important social and communal activity in both rural and town communities. And here is a painting of The Quilting Bee by Anna Mary Robertson, also known as Grandma Moses, done in 1950. The social part of quilting was a key ingredient, and similar to barn raisings, harvests, going to meeting, attending weddings, and so on, people traveled and got out around the county and the region. They didn't just stay at home and sew and preserve food and cook and harvest and all the wonderful farm things. Also, getting help sewing the blocks and quilting the quilt went faster than when you do those tasks alone. Skipping ahead to the 20th century saw the formation of quilt guilds in the late 20th century. These are formal organizations established as a way for quilters to connect. And Loudoun County has two guilds. I belong to the Waterford Quilters Guild, formed in 1979. And we use a single schoolhouse block as our logo. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I volunteered to help develop the list of potential blocks. So in keeping with the spirit of many hands make light work, I asked two members of the Quilt Guild to help me, both longtime quilters, very familiar with traditional patterns, Priscilla Godfrey and Kathy Ratcliffe. We each selected 10 patterns. They sent me a picture of the pattern and where they could find one, an outline of the block. And by working together, we started our quilt trail with 30 blocks, and we've added to them and now have about 50. And of course, here I'm only able to talk about a few of them. The Great Basket block is an example of what we put together for each pattern. There's an image of the block, an outline design of the block, a history of the block, and the historic design source where we could find them, and then a photo and narrative illustrating the connection to Loudoun County. So I put all this information together into a Word document and send them to Jill, and she arranges to put them on our trail website. The plan is that visitors to a barn quilt sign could then, using their phone or laptop, iPad, could look up more information on the website and learn more about the pattern and perhaps the barn and the farm while they were actually doing the trail. The grape basket and also the flower basket patterns are typically found arranged on the diagonal in a quilt, but they could be positioned that way on a barn or else hung in a diamond shape with the top of the basket at the top of the diamond. Now, we found a variety of sources of inspiration for quilt blocks that could be made into barn quilt signs. And these include quilt blocks on historic quilts made by Loudoun quilters that are both in public and private collections, including the Loudoun Museum in Leesburg, the Waterford Foundation here in Waterford, the DAR Museum and the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. We also looked at published patterns with traditional blocks and images of quilts and blocks in books and online, and the internet has just been literally an explosion of resources for quilters with blogs, quilt history, patterns, fabric, and so on. And then there were some traditional patterns made by current day quilters and just a few contemporary designs on recently made quilts by Loudon quilters. So those of you who are familiar with the history of quilts in America will know that the earliest American quilts in the 17th and 18th centuries were typically what they call a whole cloth quilt, one primary piece of fabric that was sometimes embroidered or appliqued or stuffed. And in the 18th century and early 19th, textiles were among the most valuable items on estate inventories. But the Industrial Revolution, beginning in the 1830s, made printed cottons inexpensive and widely available. Women and sometimes men began sewing pieced and appliqued quilts, and they developed the block patterns that we now call traditional. In Loudoun County, Quakers settled in Waterford and in the town of Lincoln in the 18th century. Now, there's no identifiable Quaker style in the way that we have come to call quilts using solid colors and bold patterns as Amish quilts. Quakers dressed in somber colors and sometimes used their dress fabrics in quilts, but they also used bright colors in traditional fabric patterns, as in this quilt that's in the Foundation's collection. This one was made around 1846 to 1850 by members of the Steer family, who signed some of the blocks. And this is basically 9 blocks that are appliqued in cotton and stitched to a linen foundation. The blocks have signatures, some have locations and dates. And so we call this a signature or friendship quilt, where it's signed and made by different people. Any of these blocks could be printed for use as a barn quilt sign, as none of them are very highly detailed and have limited colors, but it might be more difficult to paint some of them by hand. The Dutton quilt, which is also in the Waterford Foundation collection here, and this is a detail, uses silk fabrics and elaborate quilting designs. The background fabric is from the wedding dress of Emma Schooley at her marriage to John Dutton in 1838. Their daughter, Mary Frances, wore the dress in 1862 for her marriage to Franklin Steer. And a scrap of the same brown silk fabric is used in a quilt made by Waterford Quaker Susan Talbot Walker in the Loudon Museum collection. Now, the pattern block is a double Irish chain, and 9 patch blocks form the basis of the alternating blocks in this quilt. 9 patch piecing is among the earliest forms of patchwork. And in its simplest form, which you can see in the smaller blocks, it's constructed of 9 plain squares of the fabric. And it was published in the Ladies' Home Journal in 1896 and called a plain block there. The variations of a 9-patch block are endless, from the very simple to the extremely complex, both in the arrangement of the block as well as in the play of colors. And there's lots of possibilities for a barn quilt sign using 1 block or multiple blocks in just 2 colors or mixed colors. Now, the High Ridge block that you see here is in a regional pattern that's been researched by a woman named Mary Robert. It was found on quilts made by Quaker quilters from Winchester, Loudoun County, and the surrounding region. According to one story, the title of the block comes from Apple Pie Ridge, an area of countryside outside of Winchester, named for the many apple orchards planted there in the 18th century. Now, several Loudoun County quilts incorporate this block, and it's typically formed with 4 quarter sections of an applique and often sewn in red or red print fabric on white. Now, Apple Pie Ridge appears here in the far left row of this 1850 Quaker Friendship quilt. And the quilt is in the Loudoun Museum collection, but it was made by Quakers from Waterford. One block has a signature of Lydia J. Hollingsworth, who moved to Waterford around 1854, where she lived the rest of her life, and she's buried here in Fairfax Friends Cemetery. The Apple Pie Ridge star block has been found on quilts made by 19th century quilters who lived in Winchester, the Shenandoah Valley, Northern Virginia, and Western Maryland. So, not surprisingly, this block is the one chosen by the Waterford Foundation for their barn quilt trail block that's on the Bond Street barn across from where we are doing this presentation. Now, by the mid-century, pieced and applique album quilts and friendship quilts were very popular. So notice the block that's right here with the flowers on it. This block is called the Carolina Lily. So the photo here on the left is of the block on the quilt that you just saw in the previous slide. It's also a popular block in mid-19th century and well into the 20th. Its earliest publication was probably around 1890 in the Ladies' Art Company Quilt Patterns Catalog, where it was called Cleveland Lilies, presumably after President Grover Cleveland, who was in office at the time. And versions without any leaves were also published, as you see in the middle block, in the early 20th century. The same pattern is also called Noonday Lily and North Carolina Lily into the 1930s. Now, this pieced and applique signature quilt dates from 1840 to 60 in the collection of the National Museum of American History, and it uses only the Carolina Lily, alternating with plain white blocks. 21 of those blocks have signatures, and 6 of them, 6 of the surnames are family names from Lovettsville in northern Loudoun County. Either the applique or the piece version would work well as a barn quilt sign. The blazing star or lone star forms the core of this star block, the image on the left, which is on a piece quilt in the Loudoun Museum collection, dating from the early 19th century. And what's unique about that quilt is that it has blocks on both sides of the quilt. A similar quilt, also pieced in cottons, is in the DAR Museum collection in DC, and it was made by Almedia Gibson Lum of Mountville, which is another small village in Loudoun, and she did hers between 1830 and 1840. Now, this pattern was published by Ruby Short McKim in 101 Patchwork Patterns, and also in the Denver Post series in the early 1930s. McKim says, "There are ever so many quilt patterns, but none are more charming than the shaded 8-point one, often called the blazing star. This star pattern is complex, but by simplifying it with fewer shapes and colors, as in the illustration on the right, it would look good as a barn quilt sign. And there are many, many star patterns, and most of them would also look good as barn quilt signs. Now, the honeycomb, or hexagon, as it's also known, was the first known quilt pattern to be published in an American periodical, in Godey's Lady's Book in 1835. Ruby Short McKim included this pattern, which she called Grandmother's Flower Garden, and also French Bouquet, in her book, 101 Quilt Patterns, published 100 years later in 1931. Signature quilts developed in the 1840s, and these are the ones where there's writing on the quilt block, and it's in part a result of improved black inks that wouldn't rot through the cloth. So most signature quilts were made by family members and friends to commemorate a special event, such as a marriage, a significant birthday, or as a farewell gift, and also made as fundraisers for church and civic groups. The Loudon Museum has a friendship quilt, an image detail on the right, in the Grandmother's Flower Garden pattern, made by an unidentified woman, for an identified woman by her family. Most of the inscriptions are dated 1849. And the plain white hexagons form the garden path around the flower, and then the signatures are in the center of the flower. And this pattern is a good example of how a single shape, the hexagon, can create a vibrant and dynamic design when it's repeated. And again, as a barn quilt trail sign, it has an opportunity for endless variations. Now, Grandmother's Fan was another of the many quilt patterns designed by Ruby Short McKim and published in newspapers like the Denver Post and Kansas City Star. And it would include, her publications included a pattern that could be cut out as well as piecing directions. And I've mentioned McKim earlier. Her patterns were hugely popular, and she remains an icon today. Now, the owner of the quilt that is a Grandmother's Fan in this newspaper photo on the right served as a director of the Loudoun County Emancipation Association here in Loudoun, founded in the 1890s. And a family member of the owner made this quilt, and it was later used at Emancipation Day celebrations, which is September 22nd, the anniversary of the date in 1862, when Lincoln signed the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Now, the newspaper photo was taken when this quilt was in an exhibit at the Loudon Museum. And a note on the quilt mentioned, during the early days of celebrations, crowds gathered early, and by lunchtime, the grounds were covered. Many people brought their lunches and spread the food on colorful cloths on the ground. So quilts, of course, were not always just bed coverings. They could serve as a picnic cloth or sofa cover, whatever. But this is another very basic, simple pattern that would work well as a barn quilt sign. As we've seen in the 1930s, the popular pastime of quilting expanded through patterns that were published in newspapers and circulated across the country. Solomon's Temple pattern on the left was printed in the Kansas City Star in 1936, and then 60 years later, it was featured as a red and white quilt called King Solomon's Temple on the cover of the February 1996 issue of American Patchwork and Quilting. A very large pieced quilt in the Solomon's Temple pattern is in the Loudon Museum collection. possibly made by a member of the Edwards family of Green Plains Farm, which is present-day Sterling in Loudoun County. And in the center, you can see how this block, simplified in 4 colors, can show how it would work very well as a barn quilt trail sign. Now, we also looked at contemporary patterns. The 1976 bicentennial of America saw a revived interest in traditional crafts, of course, including quilting, and it's been going strong ever since. So today you can find quilts in both traditional patterns and techniques, as well as contemporary designs. Now, we use patterns from all the sources I've mentioned to inspire those on the Barn Quilt Trail website. Most, as I said, are traditional patterns, like the Wild Goose Chase, and here's a detail, which was popular for over 150 years. And the quilt in the center photo is one made by a Loudoun quilter. I think it was Priscilla Godfrey, but I'm not certain. And she made that recently. It was hanging in the town hall in Percival as an exhibit. Now, geese, of course, make regular stops in Loudoun during their annual migration, going north and going south. So the geese in this quilt block can be arranged to be flying in or out from the center, and using contrasting fabric can make it a very graphic design. The Loudoun Barn Quilt Trail has just a few contemporary blocks on the website. One example is the Cardinal block, a favorite used as a single block in wall hangings or as multiple blocks in a quilt. And of course, it's Virginia's official state bird since 1950, and easily identified cardinals are seen year-round and a favorite backyard bird. Drawing and painting a grid similar to the one shown in the quilt pattern here on the right would make it easy to use the cardinal in a barn quilt sign. Now, there's one other contemporary design that we have, which is the Loco Daisy, a block designed by Jill Evans-Kavaljan. And this is the official logo for our Barn Quilt Trail. And this block can be seen on the Mutu Orchards barn in Wheatland. And that's all I have time for. I encourage you to go to the Loudoun County Barn Quilt Trail website, and Jill can talk more about how we got our trail started.
Thank you, Jeannie. That was so interesting. And it's amazing how rich our quilt history is here in Loudoun County. We did have one question during Jeannie's presentation, and that was, is there a book available of the Waterford collection of quilts? And the answer is not at this time, but it's certainly something that we will think about putting together and sharing with the public. So you made a great segue into Jill Evans-Kavaljan, who after graduating from Virginia Commonwealth University with her BFA in painting and printmaking, Jill worked as a designer, fine artist, arts instructor, and an arts administrator. She is the founding member of the Loudoun Barn Quilt Trail, Gateway Gallery, and the Catoctin Holiday Art Tour, president of the Loudoun Arts Council, and serves on Loudoun's Rural Economic Development Council. She participates in many local shows, tours, and teaches for Clay and Metal Loft, the Waterford Craft School, and other venues. Join me in welcoming Jill.
Hi there. So, barn quilt trails, when did they become a thing? They started in 2001 in Ohio when Donna Sue Groves wanted to honor her mother, who was an avid quilter, and put a painted quilt square on her barn. And other local agricultural businesses saw that and they wanted to know more about it, and it became a trail. It took off like wildfire. What it was intended to do was highlight the cultural, economic, historical significance of the structures and the places where the quilts were. And it also honored the historical work of quilt making as women have done it over the years. So nowadays there's a barn quilt trail in almost every state in the US. And the whole thing grew organically, but it was helped by the publication of a book called Following the Barn Quilt Trail by author Susie Perrin that came out in 2012, which leads us to how we got one in Loudon. So farm owner Pamela Baldwin read that book and instantly put a quilt on her own barn. And then she contacted us on the Rural Economic Development Council to talk about whether Loudon would like to have a barn quilt trail. So Kelly Hinkle, who was our agricultural development officer, got us in touch with a colleague of hers from Garrett County, Maryland, named Cheryl DeBerry. And they had started their trail in 2007. Now that's trail now has 40 barn sites, and it's still growing. And their website, we picked her brain and we looked at her website. It has complete maps. It has kids activities. It was really inspiring. So we thought, let's put together a group to try and get this off the ground here in Loudon. We have plenty of barns. We have plenty of history and agricultural significance. We had everything we needed. So the group was formed. It was me, Jeannie, who you just heard from, Beth Erickson from Visit Loudon, Mary Kennison is a local fiber artist, and Kelly Hinkle, and we started planning. We came up with criteria. We got Jeannie to work on, we said, well, we need some quilt designs. So Jeannie got right to work on that. And then I applied for a marketing leverage grant from Visit Loudon, and we got funds to start the website build out. The first quilt, that was in 2018. The first quilt went on the first barn that fall, and that's this one, the Loudon County Daisy. And it's at in Wheatland at the Mutu Orchards Barn. It's up here, but yeah. And so you see a lot of the members of the original committee here, along with both generations of Mutu farmers on the day that the quilt arrived. So the quilts that we use, other quilt trails have used plywood or other materials, but these are foam core aluminum, very lightweight, so that you can get a really big quilt. So some of these barns are really large and you need a big graphic quilt. So we wanted to use that, and we got Patty House, who's a local sign artist in Percival, and we use her to paint them in weatherproof ink, and they hold up well in UV light and everything. And they're easy to, because they're lightweight, they're easy to hang on the quilt on the sides of the barns, and don't require special equipment. So in 2019, after this one, the Apple Pie Ridge Quilt Square, as Jeannie mentioned, went up on the Bond Street Barn across the street from where we're sitting today. And then the Great Basket, which Jeannie talked about, went up on Fabioli Cellars Tasting Room. And then most recently, the Carpenter Square went up on the barn at Franklin Park Arts Center. And hopefully there'll be many more to come. We have some other barns interested in different quilt squares. The important thing about barn quilt trails is that the historical nature is obvious when you're talking about quilts, but what we're trying to also highlight is the reinvention of these agricultural spaces, and bring also an appreciation of this very traditional women's art, and how big a part of it was in our community. So I urge you to go to loudonbarnquilts.org and take a look at some of the barns of Loudon, some of the quilts that Jeannie has researched, and learn more about the whole process. And we'd be interested, if anybody's interested in volunteering, they should get in touch with us at loudounbarnquilts.org. And I want to bring my attention to an actual quilt of the Loudoun County Daisy made by Jeannie Nichols. That's hanging behind me.
Jill, can you tell us what qualifications a person needs to be included on the trail?
Well, it helps to have an understanding of history, but I think all of us had brought different things to the committee. Kelly Hinkle had agricultural background and knew a lot of the agricultural businesses and really felt that this would be a nice addition to the other agricultural attractions in Loudoun. Beth Erickson with Visit Loudoun, she's all about tourism. I am a graphic designer, and I designed the website and the Loco Daisy, and I translated some of the quilt patterns Jeannie found into a graphic format so Patty could make them into signs. Mary Kennison's a fiber artist, but she also was a government bureaucrat for many years, and she created a work plan. And then I got my husband to do the website because that's the thing that he does. Yeah.
So as far as, are the quilts to be hung on agritourism businesses? Can private barn owners, if you have a historic barn,
on the website,
can you apply?
Yeah, we have criteria. Okay. So if you don't want anybody to visit your property, you might not want to get a quilt square, because then it wouldn't be part of the trail. Nobody could see it, right? So either if they can see it and take a picture from the road, but ideally, like I was at a venue this weekend where they had a barn where they have weddings, and they had like 2 little lights and a place where people stand and take selfies. That would be a perfect place for barn quilts. And ideally, I'd like it to be like a treasure hunt where people can go find them all and take pictures, and we could have some interactive fun with that.
Great. I wonder, Jeannie, would you like to hop into the screen here? Maybe you can chat together about your experience working together and developing the trail.
Sorry. Well, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was. Mm-hmm. It still is.
Yes.
It sounds like you really tapped into, you made a lot of networks in the county. And would you encourage another town or county that's interested in creating a barn quilt trail to?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's done wonders for Garrett County, and I can't wait to add more sites here in Loudoun. I think people have a lot of fun learning about these places, and it just doesn't have to be historical. As I was saying, it can be that your agricultural building has live bands in. It could be about music. It could be about anything that makes it culturally significant to the community.
What were some particular challenges you encountered that you didn't expect?
Well, we had to get money to make the website. That was,
yes.
Yeah. So there was the grant process, of course. And then it was a very large design project. It's a big website. It has a lot of graphics, and all of those quilt designs had to be made usable on a website, which is its own challenge. So just getting the website off the ground was probably the biggest challenge. And now we want to, post-COVID, a lot of these volunteer organizations have kind of disappeared a little bit, but Jeannie and I used to meet all the time about barn quilt, usually going to a winery, and
of course,
and plot and plan, and I'd like to get back to doing that.
Me too. And also, I think getting the word out now to people and explaining to them, because when we started out, we had a little bit of a grant program.
Yeah, economic development would subsidize putting the barn quilts on barns. So we'd have to see if we could raise some money for that, for somebody who might not have the money to get the quilts made. That being said, they're not terribly expensive to get made. And Patty's made quite a few of them now. I think she does it pretty quickly. And
yes, she does.
And they turned out beautifully.
And I think one advantage to ours versus some of the other barn quilt trails that I've heard about is that they can be removed if need be, and you don't have to nail them into the barn.
Mhm. They can be stored.
So-
They're like this thin, so they could be stacked and stored somewhere. And they could be made really large too.
Oh, and just a little bit of promotion. The Franklin Park Art Center outside of Percival in Loudon right now is inviting people to come pick up a piece of plywood and to paint a quilt square on it. But what they're looking for is a patriotic theme, which can just be red, white, and blue paint. And these are painted, and they don't have to be wildly perfect or artistic or anything. And they're going to put them on the fence line for the 4th of July weekend. So anybody who is interested can get in touch with Franklin Park Art Center.
And it's free.
Yes.
Is there a deadline?
Well, it needs to be returned to them by July 1st, or the 1st through the 3rd.
We have a question.
How is the attendant history shared with the viewer?
So when they are at the barn,
Mm-hmm.
how is the history of that? Is there a sign? Is there a
Interpretive sign?
So that was part of our original plan, was that there'd be a little plaque on each barn that would explain, but we don't have that part in place yet.
but the information is all on the website?
It's all on the website, so the thought was you could just pull it up on your phone. Mm-hmm.
How long does it take to do the tour if you're just driving from location to location?
Well, we don't have a lot of barns, so maybe 40 minutes.
Depends on whether or not you stop for a glass of wine.
Yeah, it's like you might be at Fabioli's for a little longer than the other places.
The winery, yeah. Mhm. Wonderful.
Are there any quilt blocks or patterns that we don't have on a barn yet that you'd really like to see in the future?
Oh, a ton of them actually. The flying geese pattern, I thought that would look really great. The wedding ring, we had some inquiries about some of the wedding venues about the wedding ring, and there's so many ways to do that. I think we could actually do more than one, because there's double wedding ring and a single wedding ring, and you could piece it differently. So yeah.
Exactly, change the colors, and it almost looks like a different pattern sometimes.
Mhm.
So.
Do you have a particular favorite or that you've researched and think would translate really well?
No, I like them all. I really do.
Do you actually make a quilt block or piece out of each of the ones that have been posted on a barn?
No,
Okay.
I just happen to have made the Loco Daisy as a gift for Jill, really. And I did make a quilt block for the one at Franklin Park Art Center, the Carpenter's Wheel.
And I wanted to make a quilt block that wasn't historical for this effort, because I didn't want I wanted it to be its own thing and not have connotations of another time and place. And I had to learn how to do that. I didn't do it in fabric, but it's quite a geometric task coming up with a quilt block. And I have tons of appreciation for the people who came up with these designs. Pretty intricate work.
Well, gonna hop in here.
Okay.
Thank you both. You can stay, Jeannie, because you're such an important. Thanks for joining us this evening on this inaugural multi-streaming. I know we had a little glitch with Instagram, and we apologize, but we're glad you stuck it out. And please visit us at Waterford Craft School .foundation. Waterford. No, it's Craft School. .waterfordfoundation.org. I should know this because I run the craft school. That's embarrassing.
Just go to Instagram and click on the link.
There you go. Thank you.
Or Facebook.
Or Facebook.
Or
And
Facebook.
YouTube.
And we have our videos archived on YouTube, so you can always revisit this if you want to go back and relook at some images that were presented this evening. Thanks for joining us.